The year was 1962. The world was locked in a tense standoff, a Cold War between two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. Both nations possessed nuclear weapons capable of unimaginable destruction. On October 14th, a routine U-2 reconnaissance flight over Cuba brought back chilling news. Photographs revealed the construction of Soviet missile bases on the island just 90 miles from American shores. The implications were staggering. These were not just any missiles. They were medium and intermediate-range ballistic missiles capable of reaching Washington, D.C. and other major American cities within minutes. The balance of power had shifted dramatically and the world held its breath, teetering on the precipice of nuclear war. The discovery sent shockwaves through the American government. President John F. Kennedy faced an unprecedented crisis. How should the United States respond to this blatant provocation? A direct military strike on the missile sites was considered, but it carried the risk of a full-scale nuclear exchange. The world watched and waited, the tension palpable. Faced with this immense threat, President Kennedy gathered his most trusted advisors, forming the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, known as EXCOM. They're tasked to formulate a response to the Soviet missile deployment in Cuba. The clock was ticking, each passing moment increasing the risk of a catastrophic miscalculation. The deliberations were tense. Some advisors, like General Curtis LeMay, argued for an immediate airstrike against the missile sites. Others, like Robert Kennedy, the Attorney General and the President's brother, urged caution, fearing the devastating consequences of such an attack. The world watched as the United States grappled with this momentous decision. After days of agonizing debate, Kennedy decided against a direct military strike. Instead, he opted for a naval quarantine of Cuba. This blockade would prevent Soviet ships from delivering additional missiles and weapons to the island. The world held its breath, waiting to see how the Soviet Union would respond to this bold move. On October 22, 1962, President Kennedy addressed the nation. In a somber tone, he revealed the existence of the Soviet missile sites in Cuba and announced the implementation of the naval quarantine. The world listened intently as Kennedy declared that any attack launched from Cuba would be considered an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response. The American public was stunned. The threat of nuclear war, once a distant fear, now felt terrifyingly real. Families huddled around their radios and television sets, anxiously awaiting news. Schools conducted duck-and-cover drills, preparing children for a nuclear attack. The tension was palpable, the fear tangible. The world watched with bated breath as Soviet ships approached the quarantine line established by the United States Navy. The stakes couldn't be higher. Any miscalculation, any spark could ignite a global conflagration. The fate of the world hung in the balance as the two superpowers stared each other down. The days that followed Kennedy's announcement were some of the most perilous in human history. The world held its breath as Soviet ships continued towards the quarantine line. Would they challenge the American blockade? Would this escalate into a full-blown war? The crisis reached its peak on October 27th, a day that would forever be etched in history as Black Saturday. A U-2 reconnaissance plane was shot down over Cuba, killing the pilot, Major Rudolph Anderson. The incident inflamed tensions, pushing the two superpowers even closer to the brink. Unbeknownst to the world, another terrifying event unfolded beneath the waves that same day. A Soviet submarine, armed with a nuclear torpedo, was detected near the quarantine line. Surrounded by American destroyers, the submarine's captain, believing war had already broken out, prepared to launch his nuclear weapon. Only the cool head of a single officer, Vasily Arkhipov, who countermanded the captain's order, averted a potential nuclear catastrophe. While the world teetered on the edge of nuclear war, a glimmer of hope emerged from the shadows. Secret back-channel negotiations began between President Kennedy and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev. Messages were exchanged, filled with both bluster and a desperate desire to avoid annihilation. The tension was almost unbearable. Each leader held the fate of the world in their hands. The weight of responsibility, the knowledge that a single miscalculation could lead to unimaginable devastation, must have been crushing. Yet amidst the fear and the posturing, a path to peace began to emerge. Khrushchev, recognizing the catastrophic consequences of a nuclear war, offered a way out. He agreed to dismantle the missile sites in Cuba in exchange for a guarantee from the United States not to invade the island. This was a major concession, a sign that Khrushchev too understood the terrible stakes involved. After days of tension, the world sighed in relief. On October 28th, Khrushchev announced the dismantling of Soviet missile sites in Cuba. The threat of nuclear war receded. The resolution was a testament to diplomacy. Hope for peace prevailed. 13 days of terror ended with dialogue over destruction. The agreement went beyond missile removal. The US secretly agreed to remove Jupiter missiles from Turkey. This balanced the power between superpowers. The Cuban Missile Crisis marked a turning point in the Cold War. It had brought the world to the brink of nuclear war, but it had also forced both superpowers to confront the terrifying consequences of such a conflict. The crisis led to a number of significant changes in the relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union. One of the most important outcomes of the crisis was the establishment of a direct hotline between Washington, D.C. and Moscow. This hotline, as it became known, allowed the leaders of the two superpowers to communicate directly and immediately in times of crisis, reducing the risk of miscalculation and escalation. The Cuban Missile Crisis also led to renewed efforts towards arms control. In 1963, the United States and the Soviet Union signed the Partial Test Ban Treaty, which prohibited nuclear weapons tests in the atmosphere, underwater, and outer space. This treaty, while limited in scope, was an important step towards reducing the threat of nuclear war. While the world celebrated the peaceful resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis, it is important to remember the human cost of those 13 terrifying days. The crisis had brought the world to the brink of annihilation, and the psychological impact on millions of people was profound. The fear and anxiety experienced by people in the United States, the Soviet Union, and around the world during the crisis were very real. Families grappled with the possibility of nuclear war and the knowledge that their lives could be extinguished in an instant. The crisis left an indelible mark on the collective psyche of a generation. Beyond the widespread fear, the crisis also had a very real human cost. Major Rudolf Anderson, the pilot of the U-2 reconnaissance plane shot down over Cuba, paid the ultimate price. His death and the deaths of countless others who would have perished in a nuclear exchange serve as a stark reminder of the human cost of brinkmanship and the fragility of peace. The Cuban Missile Crisis stands as a chilling reminder of the dangers of nuclear weapons and the importance of diplomacy in resolving international conflicts. The crisis also offers valuable lessons for our time, lessons about the need for clear communication, restraint, and a commitment to finding peaceful solutions to even the most challenging problems. The world today faces a new set of challenges and threats, but the lessons of the Cuban Missile Crisis remain as relevant as ever. The proliferation of nuclear weapons, the rise of new technologies, and the persistence of international tensions all underscore the importance of diplomacy, dialogue, and a commitment to peace. As we reflect on the 62nd anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis, we are reminded of our shared humanity and our collective responsibility to prevent another such crisis. The legacy of those 13 terrifying days should be a legacy of peace, a legacy that inspires us to work tirelessly towards a world free from the threat of nuclear war.